Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Scott Miller, and I am on faculty at the Darden School of Business here at the University of Virginia, and also a research fellow and director on the project on democracy and capitalism here at the Miller Center. I am thrilled to moderate today's panel as we look back on the American economy during the first 14 months of the Joe Biden administration, and also look forward to that economy moving towards the 2022 midterms and indeed the 2024 election. The economic situation is a bit confused at the moment, or at least there's kind of strange vibes about it out there, so to speak. The resilience of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has complicated Joe Biden's already difficult promise of creating a thriving, inclusive economy for all Americans. Consumer prices are rising at a rate not seen in a generation, and despite passing a landmark infrastructure bill this last November, President Biden's Build Back Better plan has largely stalled in Congress. And even more interesting, I would say, Americans remain conflicted about the economy, with consumer sentiment falling significantly since Joe Biden took office, despite the fact that the United States weathered the COVID-19 shock better than almost any other developed economy, and that largely is represented in strong wage and job growth during that time. So today, back here at least a little bit in person here at the Miller Center, we are excited to bring you a conversation with three experts on the American economy from the private sector, journalism, and academia to examine the state of the Biden economy and its possible course over the near and medium term. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today and give a few words about them. First, we have Steve Ratner, who is the chairman and chief executive officer of Willett Advisors, LLC, which is the investment arm of former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's personal and philanthropic assets. Steve previously served as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury in the Obama administration and led the Obama administration's successful effort to restructure the automobile industry after the crisis of 2008-2009. He discusses this very difficult task in his book, Overhaul, an insider's account of the Obama administration's emergency rescue of the auto industry. And he is a regular economic analyst on MSNBC's Morning Joe, where he uses lots of charts and graphs, which I very much appreciate. Also is a regular on the New York Times op-ed page. So thank you for joining us today, Steve. Next, we have Matt Iglesias, who is an economic journalist who has written for The American Prospect, The Atlantic, Slate, and now runs the Substack publication Slow Boring for tens of thousands of weekly readers. He also co-founded Vox.com in 2014 and only recently left there to start the Slow Boring. And during that time he was with Vox, he hosted what I would say is my favorite podcast ever, The Weeds. And I recommend those episodes even if you have to go back in the archive. It's one of the best things that you'll get to listen to every day. In addition to his work in journalism, he is the author of several books, most recently 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger, which I very, very highly recommend. And so we're very lucky to have Matt with us today. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
And then last but not least, we have the honor and privilege to host my colleague at UVA's Darden School of Business, Kinda Hatcham. Kinda is the Morris Plan Associate Professor of Consumer Credit at Darden, focusing on macroeconomics, banking, and monetary economics. She is a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, and has published in many of her field's leading journals, including the Journal of Political Economy, the Journal of Monetary Economics, and the Review of Economic and Statistics. Before seeing the light and joining us here at the University of Virginia, Kinda was Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. So thank you for joining us, Kinda.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, before we get started today, I just want to note that we do very much want to incorporate questions from our live audience here at the Miller Center and from our audience online. So please use the Q&A function for those of us online, and we'll get the questions into the conversation. And then lastly, before we begin, I want to note that the Project on Democracy and Capitalism is very grateful for generous gifts from Verizon, Virginia National Bank, the Marcus Praxis Fund, the Hewlett Foundation, as well as 3 private donors who have really been able to make this conversation and others like it coming up in the future possible. So we're very grateful. But without further ado, let's get started on today's conversation. So as I mentioned in my introduction, it's kind of a strange environment of the economy at the moment, at least as far as public perceptions go. In some cases, American perceptions of this economy has swung quite a bit depending on who's in office. So I'd like to start with Matt and just ask the very kind of simple question. Despite all the confusion out there in the public realm, how is the economy doing 14 months into the Biden administration?
Well, I think this has become an economy that it matters a lot whether we're talking about rates or levels, right? That if you compare where we are with where we were 2 or 3 years ago, things are looking pretty good. I mean, the employment situation is strong, incomes are higher than they were back then, household balance sheets are in much better shape than they were back then. And if you told people, there's going to be this horrible global pandemic and this is going to be sort of the endpoint into 2022, they would say, that's actually pretty optimistic, economic policy story that you're telling me. But, people in their lives care about trends, right? They care about, well, how have we been doing over the past year? And there you've seen a lot of deterioration in people's real incomes. And that's because we have had the price of basic commodities go up a lot. We had a lot of inflation even before this war with Russia and Ukraine came into effect. And the impact of the war is going to be quite negative. I mean, I think on living standards all over the world, it's depressing the availability of wheat, it's depressing the availability of fertilizers, it's depressing the availability of all kinds of metals and minerals that they extract in Russia. So, from a political standpoint, trying to tell people, well, if we went back in time and we drew a projection, we're actually doing better than it would have in a plausible counterfactual. I mean, that's going to be a tough sell to make because people are struggling in the here and now. And I think the short-term outlook is likely to get worse.
Absolutely. Steve, do you concur with Matt's opinion? Is there anything that we should be focusing on in the short term in terms of how the economy is doing right now?
I think Matt said it. I think Matt said it perfect. Sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied. I think Matt said it perfectly. I really don't disagree with anything he said. I think he laid out both the history and the present circumstances almost exactly as I would have. I guess the only things I would add are that for those of us who were around in the 70s and the late 60s when there was a lot of inflation, I think what we have learned and what the opinion polls show at the moment is that inflation is a particularly pernicious force in the minds of American consumers. They really don't like inflation. And so all of the good things that are happening, we have a record number of open jobs, wages are going up, we've had all these government programs to help the people who are left behind, household balance sheets are in good shape, and so on and so forth. All of that, strong GDP growth, all of that is being overshadowed by the inflation problem. And we can talk about, if you want, when and if you want to, the whole issue of transitory versus permanent. I have been in the permanent camp, not happily, but just dealing with the world as it is rather than the world as I wish it were. and I'm not happy that what some of us predicted has come to pass. And I do think, and again, I'll leave it to you to decide, Kevin, where you want to go from here. I do think that the process of getting inflation back to some acceptable level, and if it's 2%, it's going to be really, really hard and really, really painful for the economy to do that, potentially including even a recession at some point along the way. But I'll leave it to you to decide when you want to delve into that.
I think inflation is the primary question, which is on a lot of Americans' minds. It's currently in the news. I was recently home and in Colorado speaking with family who don't do this for a living at all, and the issue of inflation is consistently something that they're worried about. So I want to go to Kinda, because Kinda and I have talked about this issue a little bit, and being a monetary economist, Kinda is probably as good as anybody in the world to comment on these issues. So Kinda, what do you think? Is this inflation issue something that we should really be concerned about? Or is this something that recently Moody's said, inflation will moderate as the pandemic fades? Obviously, that's a very dependent issue right there, but do you have a sense of how we should be thinking about this inflation issue at the moment?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what Matt said about levels versus rates. I think it's important to keep in mind that inflation is a year-over-year calculation. So if you look at, let's say, the January 2022 number, where core inflation was 6%, that's telling you how have consumer prices, excluding the most volatile components, changed from January 2021 to January 2022. And so there are two reasons why that could be high. One is that prices are very high in January 2022. The other is that prices were low in January 2021. And I think it's important to remember the baseline that we're comparing to. So January 2021, we were still in the midst of the pandemic. Things were shut down, prices were low, demand was still somewhat artificially repressed. So I think that maybe the better gauge of inflation, just to be able to compare to historical numbers, is to think about, well, let's start in January 2020, look at the growth rate from 2020 to 2022, and then divide that by 2 to get a rough estimate, or if you're fancy, do kind of the compounded growth rate over 2 years. And you get a number that's kind of closer to 3.7, 3.8%, which is still higher than the Fed's target, that's for sure. But it's in terms of, these questions of, does this look like what we saw in the 70s? Are we headed towards the Fed needing to do a Volcker-type disinflation? They're very different scenarios. So the numbers that we're seeing now, once you account for the fact that last year was not a normal year, is not as stunning and as stark as the 6% number would suggest. The second is that the environment is very different. So, what Volcker inherited a Fed that was suffering from a credibility problem. So the pre-Volcker Fed had bowed to political pressure to kind of expand the economy to get unemployment below 6% so that the government could win the election, et cetera, et cetera. What the Fed is dealing with now is a very kind of different set of problems, but I think it is important for the Fed to, begin to show that it can rein this in. A lot of this is about expectations. And, if the Fed goes and says, all right, let's do this divided by 2 and it's only 3% and that's fine. Well, before we know it, you divide by 2 and you're at 5, 6, 7%. So the monetary contraction that's coming down the line, I think is important for the Fed to just get a handle on this. But, inflation is a problem. But it's not as, if you look at it from a macro perspective, we're nowhere near the type of environment that we had that required a multi-year recession to rein it back in. If we have a recession, it's going to be for a different reason.
Absolutely.
Well, can I?
Yes,
can I
Steve, please, go ahead.
And just to keep the conversation interesting, I'll disagree a little bit with Kinda on some of the points. Look, one, I accept. I will certainly accept the math on base effect. I mean, base effect is an issue with all kinds of economic statistics at the moment. But the fact of the matter is, we do have inflation well above the Fed's target. The fact of the matter is, the Fed went, in my opinion, both our fiscal and our monetary response to the pandemic went way too far. And look, some of it was hard to know. I will grant that. When pandemics don't come along very often, there's no policy playbook for them. And so it is, as many people in the White House have said publicly, it was, in a sense, better to err on the side of doing too much than too little. But we did way too much on both the fiscal side and the monetary side. And now we're going to pay the price. And I would say, one, I would absolutely agree that we're not in the 70s to that degree of magnitude. I think we are in the 70s in a fraction of that degree of magnitude in terms of both the Fed having a credibility problem. I think the Fed's credibility has been damaged here. I think Powell talked about transitory inflation too many times for them not to have some kind of a credibility problem. And I do think it's going to take far more, or materially more than what the Fed is currently projecting in terms of monetary restraint, contraction, whatever you want to call it, in order to get us back to 2% from whatever level you may think we're at the moment. More specifically, it's very hard to imagine that we can solve whatever inflation problem we have without real interest rates being positive. And so whether you think the inflation rate now is 3.5% or 5% or 6%, the Fed's current Fed funds targets are not going to do the job, and interest rates are going to have to be substantially higher. Interest rates substantially higher does raise the probability of some kind of recession. I agree, it's not going to be multi-year. It's not going to be what we went through in the 70s, but it does raise the probability of a recession somewhere along the way to a material level. You can't deal with inflation without reducing demand, and once you start reducing demand, you start to have other effects that can lead to a recession. And I think we ought to recognize that if not a probability, it's certainly a very large possibility.
Absolutely. And Matt, what you have been a little bit more, at least in the past, willing to tolerate a little bit of inflation to get job growth and kind of attract toward more full employment. But I was curious if you concurred with Steve's assessment that, inflation is going a little bit out of the control, and the Fed's really going to have to step on the brakes in order to get this under control. Will that be worth the trade-offs?
Well, I mean, there's clearly a need for a course correction away from stimulus. And that's what Powell is saying. Fiscal policy is shifting in a more contractionary direction as well. I think they should go further on that, frankly, on the fiscal side of things. I think that everybody, though, needs to recognize that there is no benign way to have a huge amount of the world's oil and gas and wheat exports and mineral exports taken off the global market, right? We can do macroeconomic policy to make that less inflationary than it might otherwise be. But people are going to be upset in their lives if the primary commodities that they purchase to run their cars and heat their homes and feed their families become scarcer. And there just isn't a demand side solution to that, right? You don't want to make the mistakes of the late 60s and early 70s and say, well, we can just stimulate ourselves through a negative supply shock. That would be the macro danger. We need some restraint on the macro side. We need to contain inflation, but it's not going to contain hardship in people's lives to slow the labor market as the solution to food becoming scarcer, right? We need to either prepare people to say, look, this is a cost worth paying for the sake of Ukrainian independence. I mean, in wartime, societies undertake sacrifice, and we are undertaking sacrifice for the sake of our national security goals. But we also need to look at policies on the supply side that will, relieve constraints to the production of energy and the production of other kinds of commodities, because the problem is not fundamentally on the demand side at all. It's that we are having scarcities, and demand side policy can't fix the scarcities. It can't fix them with stimulus, but it also can't fix them with anti-stimulus. We need to address them or accept them.
Yeah.
Please, just one point. Yeah. So on what Steve said about the Fed kind of and fiscal policy as well, erring they did too much. I think it's important for us to understand, why was it too much? So if you keep in mind that the Fed kind of changed its operating framework in the summer of 2020 to shift towards kind of more inclusive growth. So the way that they phrased it, I'm going to paraphrase heavily, was that they're willing to tolerate a bit more inflation in order to see metrics across different socioeconomic groups improving. It's not just the aggregate or the average unemployment rate. And so the fact that the Fed expanded its balance sheet by so much, and yet you're seeing inflation, but you saw kind of the distribution sort of move, but there is a question that we need to ask ourselves, which is there something fundamentally broken in the way that monetary stimulus reaches the people that actually need it? So if we think that funding markets are fragmented, or there are segments of the population that don't have access to credit, then you end up injecting a ton of monetary stimulus. The balance sheet gets really large. But when you think about this goal of inclusive growth, it takes so much more gunpowder at the beginning to get you to a level where it starts to look like inclusive growth. So I fully agree that we have issues on the supply side, but it's important to think about what has the experience in the pandemic taught us about the transmission channels of monetary policy, and is there something that the Fed could do, given that it is financial regulator and it sort of looks at credit markets and interbank networks and how funding flows from the largest banks to sort of the smallest banks that are involved in communities. Can we take any lessons from that in order to unsegment the banking system and allow for less stimulus to provide a better outcome than what it did on the demand side?
Can I just comment on
Absolutely, Steve, please.
I don't mean to take you out of the conversation. It's your panel, and you should moderate. But all three of us obviously have strong views and well thought out views on some of these issues. Look, on the question of inclusive growth, what Powell was trying to do, and oddly enough, it happened a bit at the end of the Trump administration as well, was essentially run the economy hot so that there would be more demand for labor. And it would create higher wages, particularly for those at the bottom. The problem is it was overdone, and you can't run the economy as hot as he ended up running it and not have a far more significant inflation problem than you would like to have. I mean, he was talking about taking inflation from a ceiling of 2% to an average of 2%. He wasn't talking about taking it to 5, 6, or 7%, certainly. Number two, I would say it wasn't so much that we learned about what the Fed can and can't do. I think we were reminded in a way about what the Fed can and can't do. Monetary policy cannot solve all problems, and monetary policy, as we were reminded, has the unfortunate, in my opinion, side effect that it often actually makes income inequality worse because it raises asset prices, and who owns assets? Obviously more wealthy people than less wealthy people. So I think we have to be careful about how much we expect the Fed to be able to solve all the country's problems versus having the Congress and fiscal policy and regulatory policy and White House policies try to solve the world's problems, and let the Fed go. The Fed already has got two mandates, right, which is to keep unemployment low and to keep inflation low. And I think you have to be careful about trying to load too much on the Fed in terms of what we ask it to do. On the supply side thing, look, I certainly agree with Matt's general approach. If we can improve the supply of goods, of labor, of whatever, then you take pressure off of inflation. But again, I think we need to be realistic about what's possible here. We're not going to replace 10 million barrels a day of Russian oil if that were to completely come off the market. 5 of it is actually, it's really 5 because 5 they use internally and 5 is exported. We're not going to replace all that. The Europeans certainly are not going to replace all that Russian gas. We're not going to replace a lot of other stuff that they produce that people don't pay as much attention to, whether it's palladium or platinum or wheat, all of which they produce in sufficient quantity that if it comes off the market, it's going to have a very, very significant effect. And I think Matt framed it well. We are going to have to make sacrifices to be on the right side of history in terms of this war, because there is going to be more inflation coming out of the war, and that is going to put more pressure on the Fed, and they're going to have to do more on interest rates, and it's going to bring us closer to, if not into, a recession at some point.
Yeah, Steve, I just wanted to interject and stay with you for a moment because you've been rather critical of the Biden administration for just insisting on the transitory narrative and especially insisting that inflation is really just the product of supply chain constraints and so on. And one of the things as I've talked with people outside of the university, so to speak, is just a fundamental question of what is causing this? Where is this coming from on a very fundamental level? So on one hand, we absolutely do have the supply chain constraints, but also the Fed dumped trillions of dollars into the economy when COVID came around, in effect, trying to prevent a massive deflationary crisis, which, as we know, has caused financial crises throughout history. So I was wondering, starting with Steve, if you have a sense for really whether this is a supply side thing in terms of the real economy, or whether this is a monetary thing, or both.
Well, it started before the war. It was a demand side problem entirely, in my opinion. The reason that we had supply side problems was because we had too much demand. If you want to talk about the famous issues at the port of Los Angeles and whether cargo ships were being unloaded or not, they actually were being unloaded at a faster rate than they were being unloaded before the pandemic, but not fast enough to meet all the demand. We put roughly $2 trillion onto household balance sheets in we put $1 trillion so there's roughly $2 trillion of excess, meaning above normal levels of cash on household balance sheets. $1 trillion of it was government stimulus programs of one sort or another, and $1 trillion of it was money that consumers couldn't spend as they would have spent because of the pandemic. And so you come out of the pandemic and suddenly $2 trillion is trying to get spent on one thing or another. And of course you're going to have supply side problems. And that's really fundamentally what happened. And then on top of that, you have the Fed driving interest rates down to zero on the short end, and historically low levels on the longer end. And so mortgages are really cheap. And so people rush out and buy houses and then they try to renovate them and you can't get a contractor to do anything. None of that should have been totally surprising. And as I said, the White House's view was better to do too much than too little. I understand that, but you have to live with the consequences of your decisions, and history is not going to regard those decisions as having been particularly prudent. And by the way, the last thing I'll say is that, I shouldn't be piling on the White House because I am a supporter and I believe most of what they've done is certainly well-intentioned and admirable. But if they'd had their way, there'd be another $3.5 trillion of stimulus that would have been passed by the Congress. And I can't even begin to imagine what the impact of all that would have been if it had come to pass as they tried to do in the original Build Back Better program.
Yeah, Kinda, on this issue of inflation, this is one of the things that I've been curious about. At what point, assuming just for the sake of argument that inflation continues to grow and it doesn't abate over the next 6 months or so, at what point would you be worried that the Fed would really have to slam on the brakes and cause a significant recession in order to keep the escalatory cycle of inflation from really getting out of control?
And so it's hard to give like a number. So if it reaches 7%, now is the time to go. I mean, I think this year is going to be extremely important for the Fed in establishing credibility. So Steve said that they have a credibility problem. Again, I mean, I would disagree with his disagreement of me that they are on the verge of a credibility problem. That is, if they allow the economy to continue at, these high rates for an extended period of time, then you start to wonder, well, maybe they've lost control over inflation. So I think it's important for them to start early. It's going to go. So again, let's go back to Volcker. So that was the ground zero for thinking about how long can the Fed keep the economy in a recession in order to get inflation to change. And it goes back to how people form expectations. And one of the issues with our profession is we don't fully appreciate or understand or have great models in the short run of how people form inflation expectations. I think there's good research coming out that suggests people look at gas prices. There's certain things that are very salient to them, and based on that, they form inflation expectations. So I think it's gotten to the point where the Fed needs to err on the side of being aggressive now in order to show that we can curb it. I don't think they need to get it to 2% necessarily. The forces that we're dealing with, I agree with Matt's point that we have to accept higher inflation. That's you take a moral stance on we are willing to accept higher prices in order to support Ukraine in this fight. And does the Fed necessarily need to correct that? It's not clear to me. So, that was a long answer. The short version of it is better to start early. Hard to give a number where they should go. I don't think you wait until you have to slam the brakes. I think you start earlier, and it allows you to calibrate a little bit better so that you're not slamming the brakes as quickly. Because the moment where you find you need to slam the brakes is the moment where you've lost control of expectations, and you don't want to get to that point.
Can I also speak up for fiscal policy in this area, which is, the long-term interest rates have remained low, perhaps surprisingly so. But it's the case, nonetheless, that the tax and spending policies that Congress enacts have a real influence on, the amount of consumption resources that are available to people. When Barack Obama was president, Democrats were very, very big on the idea of deficit reduction largely through tax increases on wealthy people. With Biden's original proposal, they flipped that around they wanted to tax wealthy people and spend the money on social safety net expansions. And that would have been, I think, a pretty inflationary agenda had it been enacted, but it wasn't. And if you reconfigure that proposal to roll back some of Trump's tax cuts in some other respect, tax the wealthy, and then you don't spend all of the money. You invest some of it in energy production, but you mostly reduce the deficit. I think that kind of fiscal consolidation helps take a little bit of the burden off the Fed of slowing the economy. Simply taking some cash out of the pockets of people who can afford it, right? Because, it's tough to bring things under control purely by reducing the number of people who are employed and the amount of wages they have, right? If you say, okay, gasoline's getting more expensive because we took this Russian oil off the market, and we're going to fix that by making 1 million people lose their jobs so they don't need to commute, that's a hard one, right? That's a tough nut to crack, even as the Fed has to do something. But Congress can target the affluent. That's, what the legislative branch is for. And they need to, I think Democrats need to acknowledge that the situation has changed from what the situation was when they wrote their programs, and they need to legislate in a way that's responsive to the actual situation, rather than that's responsive to an agenda that they cooked up, mostly in 2018, 2019, to address, real issues, but long-standing features of the American economy. They need to govern a little bit for the present situation.
Well, this is perfect with a question we got from Joe Stofa from our virtual audience. And I'm going to add a little bit onto the end of his question, but he essentially says, CPI does not include food and fuel, and while these items are volatile, they are largely a proportion of lower income households' expenditures, I'm assuming. And so how can this be addressed? And this goes to the political economy element that Matt is referring to. And so obviously the Build Back Better plan has largely stalled in Congress. But if we're looking at fiscal policy remedies to try to deal with the inflation crisis, or at least the effect of it on lower income households, do you have any specific policies that perhaps the Biden administration should really single out and push if they can't get the big plan through Congress? Anybody?
Steve?
Go ahead, Matt. Why don't you start?
I think they should try for deficit reduction. I think the most important aspect of Biden's program is the investments in climate and energy areas, and they should try to get that done, and they should try to reduce the deficit, and they should try to acknowledge that this is not the right time, I think, for a huge expansion of the welfare state. But I also think, the administration should look at what it can do with executive authority to alleviate some of the problems that people are facing. If they're so worried about shipping conditions, they could suspend the Jones Act. If they're worried about food availability, they could suspend some of the biofuel mixing rules. I mean, these are not whole solutions to our, we're facing multifaceted problems that can only be partially solved. But it's time to really go through the books in a serious way and say, what can we do that addresses inefficiencies in the system? Unfortunately, a lot of what they came into office with were programs designed to combat mass unemployment, which was the problem that they thought they were going to have based on the situation that had existed in 2020. And it's just not the situation. Like, we don't need new, stronger Buy American rules on everything. We don't have an urgent need to create more jobs. We need efficient procurement, right? We need to get what's available at the lowest possible cost, and we need to get things done.
So I agree with all that. So first, with respect to the question that was asked, the CPI actually does include food and energy. I think what the questioner was referring to is the fact that the Fed targets what they call core inflation, which excludes food and energy, on the theory that food and energy are volatile and you can't run a monetary policy around volatile prices. But the problem we face at the moment is that food and energy, in part because of the war, in part because of other factors, are looking more structural or more permanent, if you want to call it that, than transitory. Certainly more longer run than we have had them historically in the past. So we do have to think about the CPI holistically and not the core. Number two, with respect to fiscal policy, I agree with Matt and entirely with his directional approach. I would again just be a little cautionary about the realm of the possible. I think to the amount of deficit reduction that the country is going to stand for at the moment, I don't think is going to be that large. There is no appetite for actually cutting spending, which is one way to reduce the deficit. There's not much appetite for actually just increasing taxes in a full-throated way across the board. You've got the Biden administration can't even get. I'm not saying this is always critical of them. Congress won't even pass a tax increase on the wealthiest Americans. So the idea that we're going to raise taxes in some material way to reduce the deficit seems unlikely to me. I do think, and I think this was implicit in what Matt said, I do think that there should be a shift in federal fiscal priorities away from consumption-oriented spending, whether it's stimulus checks or those kinds of things, and toward investment spending. The infrastructure bill was a very good step in the right direction, but there's much more the government could do on the investment side to improve the productivity of the economy. You can call it improving the supply side. There are a lot of ways to describe it, but I think we're all talking about the same thing in that regard. And then the last thing I just want to say about consumer expectations, the fact is, however they're formed, the consumer expectations of inflation have been rising. And depending on which survey you look at, they're certainly well into the 4% range. And I do believe that if the Fed wants to retain its credibility in the long run, it cannot start abandoning its 2% target. It already fudged it by going from a 2% to an average of 2%. But I think if it wants to retain its credibility, it's going to have to somehow or other get inflation back to that level.
So yeah. Scott, can I just make one point now about monetary policy? So
Please
I think this goes back, so Steve mentioned at the beginning that we have to be careful what we ask the Fed to do. Fiscal policy is a better tool for redistribution, and that's absolutely true. But now he brought in kind of what is the constraint on fiscal policy. If you compare the benefits of monetary versus fiscal, monetary is a lot easier to make decisions on. So the implementation lag of monetary policy is so much shorter than the implementation lag of fiscal policy. The transmission lag is longer. So if you think about why the Fed might have brought upon itself this goal of inclusive growth, to be clear, I wasn't saying the Fed should do inclusive growth. The Fed made it such that it decided it wants to participate in this endeavor. And so if we're worried that on the fiscal policy side, some of the things that Matt suggested about raising taxes and using that to reduce the deficit, or maybe even raising taxes enough that we can have policies that support people that are facing higher gas prices in socioeconomic groups that are more affected by those, if we think that there's no appetite for that and it's going to take too long to get it through Congress, well, let's now go and think about monetary policy. It's not the first best. This is not what you would do in a world without constraints, but in a world where fiscal policy is hampered by all these disagreements, you start to go back to what I said at the beginning, which is, well, we have a financial system, and the financial system, given a certain amount of money, is supposed to redistribute that across the economy. All this is coming back to redistribution. If you struggle to do it through fiscal policy, is there a way to maybe achieve a redistribution of funds, by going from a certain set of banks to another? So again, I just want to be clear that since Steve brought up these constraints on fiscal policy, that's the reason why we think about monetary policy as maybe overreaching relative to what it might do in a world where you don't have these implementation lags in fiscal policy.
Well, I would respectfully, but fundamentally, I think disagree with that. I think the Fed has a really important set of jobs to do at the moment, and simply because it can operate on its own is not a reason to take responsibilities that properly belong to the executive branch and the legislative branch. Well, the Fed's part of that, but and dump them on the Fed. I think we have to solve the problem of the inability of Congress to pass meaningful legislation. Congress is just completely gridlocked, and it's not the way that it can or should operate under the present, under any set of circumstances, but especially the present set of circumstances when we have so many urgent needs. And I think we should focus our efforts on getting Congress to perform its job, just like everybody else has to perform their jobs.
Well, this brings up a question we also got from the audience, which goes exactly to a couple of the points that Kinda and Steve just mentioned. This comes from Chris Smith, who says, has the Fed's credibility been damaged already by waiting too long to take action? And then he continues to say, if real incomes have declined by 7 to 8% because of inflation, isn't that worse than most recessions that we face anyway? So I guess I just want to, I'll start with Kinda and then ask Matt and Steve to jump in. If we're talking about the credibility of the Fed as this kind of one mechanism that we have that's at least somewhat functioning right now, to what extent do we have to worry about their credibility being damaged in the eyes of the general public?
I think it's difficult to compare what we've been through over the past couple of years with any other recession that we've seen, at least that I've seen in my lifetime. This is, the shock that we got in 2020 was, this is the one point that I will agree with Steve on, that this is not a shock where the Fed should be the first line of defense. But, given how severe and pervasive it was, if you say, all right, well, this is not the Fed's job, this is somebody else's job to do, what happens in the meantime? You have communities that are suffering in the meantime, and, we will disagree on this point, but I think you do want to use the tools that you have at your disposal to kind of mitigate that to some extent. So I think, if you look at where we are now versus where we were a year and a half ago, it is a pretty stunning recovery. If you just compare this to a recession that we've had, even if you compare this to the financial crisis, this is a way bigger shock than what we saw in 2008. So it goes back to how are we gauging success? If we gauge success relative to the average recession that we've seen in the past, sure, everyone has failed miserably. But if you think about just how big the shock is and you normalize for that, I would think that's important to keep in mind. And given the amount of stimulus that they put in, maybe it was too much. Maybe it was too much given the constraints that they face, given that there's something broken in the financial system. We're at a point where when you do the inflation rate over 2 years, it's 4%. So I would say, all things considered, it doesn't to me look like they've lost their ability to control the economy, but that doesn't mean they rest on their laurels. I think now is the time where, rightfully so, you become aggressive and you show that you can rein it in. So again, all this to say, it's important what we compare to. This is not a shock that looks like anything we've seen before, and I don't think the traditional metrics of recovery are the ones that we should use.
So on credibility, I would say it's useful to sort of look at some of the financial market data, which unfortunately is hard to show in a situation like this. But if you go back to before the war, as Steve was saying, you had inflation before the war, and that inflation was overwhelmingly on the demand side. We had overshot the mark a little bit in order to avoid the kind of problems we had in the Great Recession. But so I don't think that there was a credibility issue pre-war, that if you look at the 5-year break-even rates for inflation, they were pretty good. I mean, people thought that we had overshot, but that the Fed would bring it back down to earth. Then the war comes and inflation expectations went up quite a lot because no one is sure how the Fed will respond to that or what even a good response would be. It's just a big negative hit to the economy. Then Chair Powell, did a speech a few days ago in which he tried to demonstrate sort of resolve against inflation. And the headline said, we're ready to do more. But since that speech, the expected inflation has ticked up a little bit when I think you would want to see it ticking down, right? So we are, I think, in the midst of a bit of not a credibility crisis, but a critical moment for credibility. Right? People are watching the Federal Reserve very closely. And I think that they want to hear that the Fed is not going to make excuses, right? That, there's something to the transitory idea. But what we're seeing with the war is that life is just kind of one damn thing after another. And you are either committed to hitting your target or you aren't. And they're going to need to redouble their commitment and make the moves on rates that make people think that they're serious about it. I think they probably will. I mean, I'm one of the people who feels the Fed is credible, but we're going to have to see what they say and do over the next couple of meetings. I mean, I thought the idea of going to more than 1 basis point per meeting just to remind the world that they can, that option is available, makes a certain amount of sense. But the long-term interest rates remain low, which I think means people think it's more likely that we would have a recession to forestall permanently higher inflation than that we would have permanently higher inflation. That's not a great outcome either, but it is a credible.
But I think the way Matt framed it is exactly right. But here's the Fed's conundrum. Before the war, there had started to be some agitation in the markets or suggestion in the markets that when the Fed started to raise interest rates at this March meeting, it should raise them by 50 basis points, not a quarter, because it was becoming clear that inflation was a worse problem than anybody thought it was. Then the war came along, and the war has had, as I think we've hopefully all three of us made clear, has had 2 negative impacts on global economies, including ours. One is it's made the inflation problem worse from the supply side and the loss of supplies, so to speak, from Ukraine and Russia. And secondly, it's going to be a drag on global growth because you've got supply lines disrupted, you've got the world economies disrupted, you have more inflation, all of that is a negative for growth. And so the Fed comes into the March meeting and it's now facing 2 problems, not just one problem. It's facing an inflation problem and it's also facing potentially a growth problem. And so the Fed made a decision, which the market has accepted, that it was only going to go up by 25 basis points at the March meeting, not even think about 50 basis points at the March meeting. And now, as Matt said, I think the markets are watching very closely what the Fed does next. And I think that the people who are on the right side of history are basically saying the Fed is going to have to start increasing rates by more than 25 basis points in order to get inflation under control. The Fed has not, and if you look at their dot plots, which are their projections of future interest rates, they have not signed on to that program at all. They're looking at 25 basis points per quarter. And we're going to see how this shakes out. But I do think the Fed is going to have to move more aggressively, whether you want to call it maintain their credibility or restore their credibility. I don't have a big disagreement over, I don't think with either Kendall or Matt over this. The Fed has got to, I think, move more aggressively at some point along the way here to deal with the inflation problem, and that will come at the expense of growth.
Absolutely. One of the things that I wanted to touch on for sure, and this discussion of the inflation issue just exemplifies the fact that inflation is right in our face. It's very easy to see on a common basis for average citizens. But let's look forward just a little bit. Let's assume for the moment that the Fed gets inflation under control, that we don't see a long-term inflationary trend like we did in the 70s. I'm an economic historian who focuses on financial crisis, so I'm kind of a dark cloud guy as opposed to, hey, let's look at the sunny situation in the futures. But I'd like to reach out, if we're looking out kind of in the medium term, say 5 to 10 years, what would you say, starting with Kinda, are things that we may want to be concerned about and have policymakers think about in anticipation of something in the future?
So I guess I'll start from, smallest to biggest. Again, given that the Fed has said that it cares about inclusive growth, I think it really needs to think about the transmission channels of monetary policy and whether it allows it to achieve this more broad, so when it provides monetary stimulus, can you set yourself up for success by saying, we're willing to tolerate a little bit higher inflation in order to see, unemployment rates across different socioeconomic classes look more evenly distributed? If there's something fundamentally broken, if there's something that's preventing a given stimulus from reaching the people that a given monetary stimulus from reaching the parts of the economy that really need it, that operating framework is going to generate problems in the long run. So every time they want to be expansionary, they're going to end up erring on the side of being too expansionary. And then we're going to find ourselves, in another webinar discussing the Fed erred, and now we're dealing with an inflation problem. So I think there is just operationally a question of, it's a very noble goal. If they can accomplish it, it would be fantastic. But can they actually get the same sort of effectiveness of monetary policy when it was just an average thing, a first moment thing? Now when they're thinking about the second moment, do the channels of transmission allow for that goal to be achieved? If they don't, I think they haven't set themselves up for success, and that's a concern you would have about your central bank. So I think that's just at a baseline, the identity of the Fed is something that we need to think about. In terms of the U.S. economy more broadly, the past couple of years and the shocks that we've gotten, I think, have shown us that there are critical industries that we need to be a bit more self-sufficient in. And, my colleagues at Darden that are, all the gains from trade and globalization and will disagree with me on this, but I think pharmaceuticals is an area where, the U.S. probably needs to be able to do stuff more in-house. I think it was, it was impressive how quickly we ramped up testing capacity and vaccines, but I think we need to think carefully about this. This pandemic may sort of be fading out, but we need to be resilient to those things. And energy, oil, not saying we become oil independent per se, but those seem like critical industries that we need to think about. How do we make it such that we don't rely as much on others? So globalization is great, but you accrue the most benefits when you're dealing with countries that have the same sort of values as you, or the same, and their social welfare function is the same. And then cybersecurity. I mean, you can't sort of have this conversation without saying cybersecurity risks are real, especially as they might affect the banking system.
Matt?
Yeah, I think that that's all broadly correct. I do think this is a little bit outside the scope of economics, but it's important for policymakers to recognize, and ideally, I think, be a little more honest about the fact that there are costs to some of these different ideas, though, right? I mean, we can promote more self-sufficiency in certain key areas, and that can give us more flexibility in terms of the foreign policy and national security choices we make. But there's an economic cost to it. I mean, I think that when I hear when I heard Biden talk about these questions at the State of the Union, his rhetoric implied that it was still the circumstances of 10 years ago when he was vice president and when there was this huge pool of unemployed workers, and that if you could simply mobilize them into domestic industry, you would have like win-win-win for economic security and all of those things. That's not the case now, right? We can hedge more against interdependence with China, with Russia, things like that, but that is going to mean configuring ourselves into a somewhat less productive economic landscape. Or we could have decided like not to be so hard on Russia, right? I mean, we could have made the choice to say, look, fundamentally, it's more important to us to get inflation under control, to boost domestic living standards, to have a lot of grain available to the world. But we chose not to do that, right? And people put these flag emojis in their Twitter icons, and they, pressured Starbucks to close down its outlet in Moscow. What happens when you take a big stand on something important against a large, important country is there is a hit to real living standards. And there's nothing you can do in the policy range that makes that hit go away. You have to convince people on some level that it's worth it, that the national security strategy is working in some sense, and that it is a price worth paying for our values, for global stability, for whatever else there is out there. And, that's a tough one, right? I mean, that's what, for good reason, politicians don't like to tell the public that the decisions they are making come with stark trade-offs, but that is the reality, right? I mean, we can gain more self-sufficiency, but it comes at an efficiency cost.
Yeah, look, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It comes at the reason that the world has become so interdependent is because trade, as we all learned in economics 1, is a good thing, and it allows everyone to be better off by sourcing whatever they need at lower cost from somewhere else, and then providing some services of their own to the rest of the world at lower cost. And that's exactly part of why we have had a very benign inflationary environment for so many years until the very recent past. And so there's absolutely a cost, and the cost is not small. And the reality is that we're not going to become independent, particularly on things like natural resources that we don't even have, that are critical to us but are produced elsewhere, and we're just going to have to learn how to live with that. We certainly should be looking at certain kinds of things, whether it's N95 masks or whatever, that are important from a public health or a national security point of view, that we should be willing to pay the cost to source them here rather than in China or somewhere else. But broadly speaking, the economic cost of trying to go back to a level of trade that existed 20 years ago would be huge. In terms of the question of what's the biggest challenge 5 or 10 years from now, my overwhelming vote would be, certainly within the parameters of government policy, my overwhelming vote would be the fiscal problem. We had a structural fiscal problem, i.e. deficits being too large going into the pandemic. It's obviously much worse now. And as I said earlier, I don't see any appetite in Washington at the moment to address it. That's not where Washington's head is at in a meaningful way. There's some talk, but it's not all that substantive in my opinion. And it's just going to have to get addressed. And that's going to be really painful and really expensive. But it's an intergenerational threat that we have to address. And I just hope we do at some point.
Absolutely. We have just a couple of minutes left, but we have a question from our live audience here in the Miller Center, and I definitely want to get to that to close us out. So, ma'am, please.
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists. In terms of there being intergenerational threat to fiscal policy and the Biden agenda, I have vested interest in asking this question about student debt forgiveness. Students haven't made payments on their debt for almost 2 years. We talk about inclusive growth. Do you see there being any appetite for Biden following through, potentially, on some student debt forgiveness?
This is a really tough issue, and I'm not an expert on it, but I'll make one or 2 points. It's a really tough issue of equities, and it's actually, in my mind, relatively similar to the issue that we faced not particularly well, or dealt with not particularly well, in housing after the subprime and the collapse of housing prices, which is that how do you help people who truly need help, but the people who don't need help because they behaved in a different way. And so, for example, what I'm saying is that if you take 2 students, one of whom worked his way through college, his parents cobbled together the money however they could, mortgaged their house, didn't take vacations, gave up eating, steak on Saturdays, whatever they did, so the kid could go to college and not have a huge amount of student debt. And you compare that to another family that said, we're not going to change our lifestyle, we're still going to go on vacation, we're still going to eat steak, and you just go borrow the money to go to college. Why is it fair to society, and this money is coming from all of us as taxpayers, to address the kid whose family decided that he should go to college by loading up on student debt versus the kid who went to college without adding to their student debt? So I don't have a great answer to this. I'm very sympathetic to the people who have overwhelming and unsustainable amounts of student debt, but there are issues of equities here that are going to come into play just as they did in the housing crisis, and we saw what happened in the housing crisis and what the blowback was from that. So maybe Matt or Kinda have a solution. I don't have one off the top of my head, but I see the problem, and I also see the potential consequences of a bad policy response.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much to our audience. We are just about at time. So I'd like to ask our in Miller Center audience and our virtual audience to thank our guests, Steve Ratner, Matt Iglesias, and Kinda Hatcham, with a round of applause. And I'd just like to remind our audience that there are, and to keep their eyes open for upcoming Project on Democracy and Capitalism events, including April 13th. We will be having a panel on the economic implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the possibility of economic crisis kind of verging out of that. So with that, I would again like to thank our guests and say everybody have a wonderful afternoon.